Okay, let's unpack this. You might be hearing some chatter, maybe some noise about potential shifts coming down the line, changes that could really, impact federal employees and retirees. And if you're like our listener, the learner, you want to understand what's actually happening, right? Without feeling like you need a PhD in government bureaucracy. So that's where we come in.
Exactly. Think of this as, well, your shortcut. We're trying to get you up to speed on some pretty complex but important proposals without getting totally lost in the legislative weeds.
Today, we're diving deep. We're looking at what the sources are telling us about potential changes to the federal employees' retirement system, FERS. That's the main retirement system for most federal and postal workers hired after, 1983?
That's right, post 83. And we're not stopping there. We're also looking at the kind of ongoing big picture discussions around Social Security, plus possible tax changes that might affect seniors, and some, well, broader federal budget ideas that could have some pretty wide-ranging effects.
Yeah, and we've pulled information from, well, all over the place to bring you this overview. We've got updates, straight from sources on YouTube covering federal benefits, detailed policy analysis from think tanks like Brookings and the Peterson Foundation.
Uh-huh. And financial insights, too, from places like Kiplinger and The Street. Plus, of course, official government budget documents and news reports from outlets like PBS, NPR, and the AP. So, a real mix.
So our mission here, it's pretty straightforward. We want to pull out the most important bits from all this stuff, explain what it could actually mean for you, maybe highlight anything that seems a bit surprising, and really just try to bring some clarity to what can feel like a confusing landscape sometimes.
And what's fascinating right off the bat is how quickly some of these ideas seem to be moving. We've literally seen proposals pop up, then change, and in some cases even disappear in a pretty short time frame.
Yeah, it really shows how dynamic that whole legislative process can be, doesn't it?
As
Okay, so let's start with FERS. For those who might not live and breathe this stuff, FERS usually have a few key parts, right? There's the basic benefit, that's the pension part, Social Security coverage, and then the thrift savings plan, the TSP, which is like a 401k.
Correct. And employee contributions to that pension part, the basic benefit, they vary. It depends on when you were hired.
Right. Now, back around mid-May, just recently, the House Oversight and Reform Committee put out a draft bill. And in Section 9001 of that draft, there was this proposal. It suggested increasing FERS employee contributions to 4.4% for everyone, like across the board. All civilian and postal employees, didn't matter when you started.
And that's a pretty significant change if you look at how things are now. If you were hired before 2013, you're currently paying either a really low 0.8% or maybe 3.1%. If you came on board in 2013, you pay 3.1%. And if you joined after 2014, well, you're already at that 4.4% level.
So this proposal, it really would have hit those longer-serving federal employees the hardest, the ones hired way back. I mean, imagine going from paying, less than $1 for every 100 you earn to over $4. That's
a noticeable hit to your take-home pay, no question.
Exactly. But here's where the story takes a bit of a twist. Around that same time, the Fed Corner YouTube channel, they focus specifically on federal employee benefits. They reported something interesting. Apparently, this proposed contribution increase, it's been removed from the bill.
Removed. So for now, at least, it seems that particular change is off the table. It does make you wonder, what kind of feedback or maybe pushback led to that decision.
Yeah, definitely. It really underlines that these initial proposals are just that they're initial. They're often just a starting point for talks, right? And
Yeah.
things can change.
Absolutely. They can be influenced by all sorts of factors as they move or try to move through the whole process.
Okay, now, another big FERS-related thing that was floated, the potential end of the Social Security annuity supplement. This was for federal retirees who leave service before they hit age 62. It was in Section 9002 of that same draft bill.
Ah, yes, the FERS supplement. And for listeners, maybe just a quick reminder, this supplement, it's designed to sort of bridge the income gap for those folks who retire early before they're actually eligible to start collecting Social Security benefits at 62.
Right. It's like a temporary support payment helps make early retirement a viable option for some people.
Exactly. Provides some financial stability until their Social Security kicks in. Now, the original plan in that draft bill was to eliminate this supplement for all new federal retirees, anyone retiring after the bill was enacted.
Okay, but importantly, the initial draft did say that people already getting the supplement would be grandfathered in, right? Their payments wouldn't stop.
Correct. That was specified, which, makes sense. You generally don't change the rules midstream for people already relying on that income.
True. But it did create some nervousness, I guess.
Yeah.
For people thinking about retiring early soon, like maybe taking a VERA or a DRP offer, say, in September 2025. The draft didn't explicitly say if they would be grandfathered.
Right. That ambiguity likely caused some real concern for federal employees getting close to that retirement window. There was, however, an exception noted even in the initial draft.
Oh,
Yeah, for federal employees with mandatory early retirement ages, law enforcement officers, firefighters, air traffic controllers. The proposal acknowledged their situation is different.
okay. Well, here's another pretty significant update on this particular issue. According to the Fed corner again, the elimination of this FERS annuity supplement, it's now been pushed back to January 2028.
Wow, 2028, that's a big delay.
It is. So for anyone who retires before that date, January 2028, it looks like this benefit will still be available. That's a really crucial piece of info for anyone planning their retirement timeline right now.
Absolutely. That delay gives a much longer runway for federal employees thinking about early retirement, offers a lot more certainty for their planning. It really just highlights how important it is to keep tracking these legislative discussions as they evolve. Things can change fast.
No kidding. Okay, what else? We also saw a proposal, didn't we, to change how the actual pension amounts are calculated for both FERS and the older system, CSRS.
Uh-huh. The high 3 versus high 5 debate.
Exactly. Instead of using the average of your highest 3 years of salary, the high 3, the proposals in Section 9L03 was to shift to a high 5 average. So what's the potential impact there?
Well, basically, by including 2 more years in that average calculation, it could potentially lower your overall pension amount, especially if those extra 2 years were, lower earning years earlier in your career.
Right, it kind of dilutes the average. Your best 3 versus your best 5.
Mm-hmm.
A 5-year average might be lower.
Precisely. However, and this is another key update, this high 5 proposal, it has also reportedly been eliminated from the bill. Again, that's according to the intel from the Fed corner.
Okay, so it really seems like the biggest potential shakeups to the core FERS pension formula and the contribution rates, they've been maybe avoided, at least for now.
It certainly looks that way based on these updates.
But there were a couple of other FERS-related ideas in that initial draft bill, weren't there?
Yes, a couple more focused things. One was the idea of setting up filing fees for claims and appeals that go to the Merit Systems Protection Board, the MSPB. That was Section 9005.
Okay, fees for appeals. And the other?
The other was a plan for a pretty comprehensive audit of federal employee dependents, specifically those enrolled in the Federal Employees Health Benefits Plans, FEHB. The idea was to recertify their eligibility and make sure everyone enrolled is actually eligible. And they estimated this could save around $1.5 billion.
An audit to check dependence on health plans. That sounds, well, maybe not surprising. Large employers sometimes do that, right?
It's a fairly common practice in large benefit systems, yeah, focused on cost management and ensuring program integrity.
It's also interesting what didn't make it into this draft bill, things that have been talked about before.
Right, like ideas about charging federal unions for using agency resources or official time, or potentially increasing the threshold for federal employee buyouts. And that big one that talk about maybe switching FEHB, the health insurance program, to more of a voucher-based system.
Yeah, that voucher idea definitely had a lot of people paying attention. Could have been a huge change to healthcare benefits.
It could have. The fact that these didn't even appear in this initial draft might suggest they faced, well, maybe significant hurdles or just weren't seen as immediately pressing as the other FERS proposals.
Now, you mentioned these FERS changes were being considered under budget reconciliation. Why is that term significant here? Why should listeners care about that process?
Budget reconciliation is, well, it's a special pathway in Congress. It allows certain types of bills, specifically those dealing with spending, revenue, and the debt limit, to pass the Senate with just a simple majority.
So 51 votes instead of the usual 60 needed to break a filibuster.
Exactly. It bypasses that 60-vote filibuster hurdle for specific fiscal matters. So it can be a faster and politically sometimes an easier way to get certain financial changes enacted. But there are strict rules about what can actually be in a reconciliation bill. It generally has to have a direct impact on the federal budget. You can't just stick any policy change in there.
Got it. Okay, so that gives us a pretty good picture of what's been happening or maybe not happening now with those proposed FERS changes. Sounds like things are still, well, fluid.
Very much so.
Let's zoom out a bit then. Let's talk about the broader discussions around Social Security reform. You mentioned earlier the FERS supplement conversation kind of connects to this.
It does, yeah. The debate over the first supplement, it really just highlights this ongoing need to figure out the long-term financial health of our big retirement systems.
Mm.
And Social Security is, I mean, obviously it's a huge piece of that puzzle. There are tons of ideas floating around about how to keep it solvent for future generations.
Okay, so the Peterson Foundation, working with Brookings, they put together this bipartisan roadmap for Social Security reform. Sounds comprehensive. What were some of the proposals they outlined for potentially reducing benefits? What was the thinking there?
Well, they presented several options, yeah. And generally, these were aimed at either bringing in more money or slowing down how fast benefits grow, basically to address the projected funding gaps down the road. One idea was to gradually increase the full retirement age, maybe especially for higher earners. Another was potentially increasing the number of working years used in the benefit calculation. Right now, it's your highest 35 years, maybe bump that to 38 or 40.
Okay, longer work history factored in.
Yeah.
What else?
They also floated ideas like potentially taxing all Social Security benefits for higher income folks, looking at changes to, or maybe even ending benefits for dependent retiree spouses in some cases,
Yeah.
and possibly eliminating benefits for child retirees under certain circumstances. The goal behind these kinds of things is usually focused squarely on long-term solvency for the system.
Right, making the numbers work long term. But they also looked at the other side, potential benefit improvements.
Yes, they did. To offer a balanced view, they looked at areas where maybe current benefits are seen as inadequate or where there are gaps. So some ideas included things like increasing survivor benefits for spouses of workers who've passed away, creating a specific disability benefit for older workers who might not quite qualify under the current, sometimes strict, rules.
Interesting.
Also, restoring or even expanding student benefits for kids of disabled or deceased parents, providing a child benefit maybe to grandparents or other relatives who step in to care for children, and improving benefits for disabled adult children. These kinds of changes are typically aimed at, strengthening the social safety net that Social Security provides.
So adjustments to specific benefits, both potentially reducing and increasing. Did their roadmap touch on other sort of broader reform ideas?
It did. They looked at some wider systemic things, too, like dedicating all the money collected from taxes on Social Security benefits directly back into the main Social Security trust funds, the OASDI funds.
Okay, keeping that tax revenue within the system.
Exactly. Other ideas included exploring ways to maybe expand the labor force, perhaps through changes to legal immigration policies, and trying to achieve universal Social Security coverage, maybe by bringing in some state and local government workers who currently have separate retirement systems.
Okay. Now, stepping away from think tank roadmaps, we've also seen actual legislation proposed, right? Like Representative Angie Craig's "You Earned It, You Keep It" Act. What's the main thrust of that one?
Yeah, her bill takes a different angle. It focuses on eliminating federal taxes on Social Security benefits starting in 2025. But to pay for that and also help Social Security's finances long term, the proposal is to raise the cap on earnings subject to the Social Security payroll tax.
Raising the payroll tax cap. So higher earners would pay Social Security tax on more of their income.
Exactly. Right now, there's a limit, an income ceiling, for Social Security taxes. This bill would raise that ceiling significantly. And analyses suggest that this approach could indeed extend Social Security's solvency, maybe by quite a bit, and potentially help reduce the federal debt over time.
We hear that idea floated a lot, just get rid of the Social Security tax cap completely.
Yeah.
What are the arguments for and against just doing that?
Well, the pro is pretty straightforward, right? It would bring a lot more revenue into the Social Security system immediately, since high earners would pay taxes on all their income, no cap. But as some groups like the Manhattan Institute have pointed out, there's a potential complication.
Which is?
Currently, that cap on contributions also sort of functions as an informal cap on the benefits that high earners eventually receive. If you totally remove the tax cap, there'd likely be immense pressure to also remove any limits on future benefits tied to those higher contributions, which could mean much, much larger payouts down the road, potentially offsetting some of the savings. It links contributions and benefits.
Interesting trade-off there. Okay, sticking with taxes and seniors. There's been other proposals focused specifically on tax relief for older Americans, haven't there?
Yes, definitely. There's a bipartisan bill called the Bonus Tax Relief for America's Seniors Act, and also a related proposal from House Republicans. Both are aimed at increasing the standard tax deduction, but specifically for people over age 65.
Increasing the standard deduction just for seniors, how would that help with taxes on Social Security?
Well, financial news outlets like Kiplinger and The Street have covered this. The idea is that by significantly boosting the standard deduction for seniors, it could effectively shield more of their total income, including Social Security benefits, from federal income tax. Basically, it raises the income threshold before their Social Security even starts to become taxable.
And do we know how much they're proposing to increase it by?
The number that's been mentioned in some reports is a new standard deduction amount around $43,200 for those over 65.
Wow, $43,200. That's a pretty substantial increase. It's interesting to contrast these sort of targeted tax relief ideas with President Trump's best campaign pledge.
Right.
Didn't he talk about completely eliminating Social Security taxes?
He did mention that, yeah.
What would be the huge challenge with doing something that drastic?
Well, as Brennan Clark discussed on his YouTube channel, the absolute fundamental challenge is funding. How do you pay for it? Social Security is overwhelmingly funded by those payroll taxes. You take away that massive, consistent revenue stream, and it becomes, well, extremely unclear how the system would continue to pay out benefits to millions and millions of current and future retirees, plus those on disability. You'd have to find an enormous alternative source of funding, and where that would come from is a huge question mark.
Right, a fundamental shift. Okay, so lots to chew on regarding Social Security and taxes. Let's pivot again. Let's talk about President Trump's budget proposals for fiscal year 2026. What are the big themes, the potential impacts we're seeing outlined there?
So President Trump released what's often called a skinny budget. It's more of a high-level outline of spending priorities for the upcoming fiscal year. And a really key theme is a major focus on cutting non-defense discretionary spending pretty significantly, while at the same time proposing increases for defense and for homeland security.
Okay, cutting domestic programs, boosting defense, and border security. Is that the gist?
That's a fair summary, yeah. The stated goal is often framed as reducing the size and scope of the federal government in certain areas while really bolstering national security functions.
And we saw specific mentions, of proposed eliminations for programs related to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion critical race theory, and what they call the Green New Scam funding, plus programs they feel have been, quote, weaponized against Americans.
Yeah.
Can you give us a sense of what specific kinds of programs might fall under those umbrellas?
Well, the skinny budget itself doesn't always list every single program line by line. It's more about setting broad direction. But generally, it points towards potential cuts for offices or initiatives within federal agencies that focus on promoting diversity and inclusion. It could target environmental programs tied to climate change initiatives that the administration opposes, and possibly funding for investigations or enforcement activities that are viewed through a political lens as being biased or, as they put it, weaponized.
Okay. And on the flip side, the Homeland Security increase has sounded substantial. What's the main focus of that proposed extra spending?
Yes, the proposal includes a really significant jump, nearly 65%, I believe, for the Department of Homeland Security. And the number one priority there is clearly border security.
Okay, so what does that translate to? More wall, more agents.
Pretty much all of the above. Substantial funding requested for building and maintaining sections of border wall. Big increases sought for immigration enforcement efforts, including talk of mass removal campaigns. Plus, money for more detention beds, more border security technology, and hiring significantly more Border Patrol agents and Customs and Border Protection officers.
Right. A major focus on the border. Now, turning to some other key domestic areas, we've seen reports about potentially really deep cuts to the National Park Service budget. What could that actually mean on the ground for people visiting parks?
The National Parks Conservation Association, the NPCA, has raised some serious alarms about this. Some estimates based on the proposal suggest the Park Service could face a reduction of maybe more than 75% in their core operations funding. That's huge.
75%. Wow.
Yeah. If cuts anywhere near that level were actually enacted, the impact could be, well, dramatic. You'd likely see major reductions in staffing levels across the park system, limited operating hours, maybe closures of visitor centers or campgrounds, and just an overall decline in the basic maintenance and upkeep of hundreds of national park sites all across the country.
That would be incredibly visible, wouldn't it? Affecting these places so many people love. What about health and education programs? What are the proposals looking like there?
So, Healthcare Dive reported on a proposed cut of around 26% to the discretionary funding for HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services. And that could significantly impact key agencies like the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, which funds medical research.
And the reasoning given for those cuts.
The administration's rationale often centers on reducing what they describe as fraud, waste, and abuse, and also targeting funding for programs that align with policy areas they oppose, maybe certain types of public health initiatives or specific avenues of medical research.
Okay, and education.
IRED Dive detailed proposed cuts to various Department of Education programs as well, including the potential elimination of specific grant programs like the TRIO programs and Gear Up, which support college access for disadvantaged students. The arguments sometimes made are that these programs might contribute to rising college costs or perhaps aren't as effective as intended.
Hmm. These proposed cuts across quite a few domestic areas sound really significant. How do these individual agency proposals connect to this idea of the one big, beautiful bill that's been mentioned?
Ah, yes. The White House budget document itself actually refers to these proposed increases in defense and homeland security spending as being made possible through the passage of what they call President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill.
So that bill is seen as the key to enabling these spending shifts.
It seems that way. The expectation appears to be that this single, comprehensive piece of legislation could potentially be enacted using that budget reconciliation process we talked about earlier, the simple majority vote in the Senate. So this bill looks like it's intended to be the main legislative vehicle for pushing through many of the administration's key policy and spending priorities.
And various news outlets have been reporting on what might actually be in this House-passed bill, this one big, beautiful bill.
Yeah.
Can you give us a quick rundown of some of the key provisions people are talking about?
Sure. Reports from places like AP News, CBS, and others have highlighted several potential elements. Things like a temporary expansion of the child tax credit, the creation of these things being called Trump accounts, basically savings accounts for children, maybe with an initial federal contribution. Of course, the big funding increases for border wall construction and wider immigration enforcement that we mentioned.
Right.
And the significant boost to defense spending. There's also been talk about potential changes to Medicaid, though there's debate whether these are actual cuts or measures aimed at program integrity. Expansions of work requirements for SNP, the food assistance program, possibly with states having to share more of the cost, the proposed elimination of the federal tax on firearm silencers, and even discussion of a potential new tax on remittances, money sent by individuals in the U.S. back to other countries.
Wow, that's a really broad mix of policy changes potentially bundled together. We've also seen some analysis comparing the potential effects of different economic plans on the national debt, right?
Yes, PBS reported on some work by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. They're a nonpartisan watchdog group. And their analysis suggested that, well, both President Trump's and Vice President Harris's economic plans could lead to increases in the national debt over the next decade.
Okay, both potentially increasing the debt. Any difference in scale?
Their projections indicated that President Trump's proposals, largely due to the scale of proposed tax cuts combined with spending increases, might result in a more significant increase to the debt compared to the projections for Vice President Harris's plans. It really comes down to the specific mix of tax policies and spending levels in each agenda.
Gotcha. And one last point connected to budgets and taxes.
Yeah.
We touched on the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act earlier. Sounds like the jury is still out, or at least there's ongoing debate, but its actual economic impact.
That's absolutely correct. The economic effects of the TCJA are still being actively studied and frankly debated. You see analyses from institutions like the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, Brookings, CFO.com. Some findings do suggest there was a positive, maybe short-term bump in job growth right after the tax cuts were passed.
Okay, some positive signs.
But there's also evidence suggesting that the big increase in business investment that was hoped for, well, a larger share of that might have actually gone towards investments abroad by U.S. companies rather than primarily boosting investment domestically here in the U.S., which, wasn't necessarily the main intended outcome of the legislation. So it's complex.
Definitely sounds like it. Okay, there's one last area that seems to keep popping up in some of these proposals and the wider policy discussions. And that's the whole debate around work requirements, especially for programs like SNAP and maybe Medicaid.
Yes, the idea of expanding work requirements for people receiving certain types of federal assistance is definitely a prominent and often contentious point of discussion. As we mentioned, the House bill includes language to expand these requirements for SNAP recipients, and there have been broader conversations about potentially applying similar requirements to Medicaid eligibility as well.
And what's the main argument for these work requirements? What do proponents say?
Well, proponents, like you might hear from think tanks such as the Heritage Foundation, often argue that these requirements are important to incentivize employment. The idea is they promote individual self-sufficiency, reduce dependency on government aid, and help ensure that taxpayer-funded benefits are primarily directed towards those who are truly unable to work or are actively seeking work.
Okay, that's the argument for them. But we've also seen research that paints a different picture, right? About their effectiveness and potential downsides.
That's right. Research highlighted by places like the Brookings Institution, among others, often suggests that work requirements don't necessarily lead to significant, sustained increases in employment rates over the long term. Instead, what sometimes happens is that eligible individuals end up losing access to crucial benefits like food assistance or health care.
Why? Just because of the bureaucracy.
It can be due to administrative hurdles, difficulties in documenting work hours, lack of available jobs or transportation, childcare issues, a whole host of reasons. So these studies often raise concerns that the requirements can end up harming vulnerable populations by cutting off support without actually leading to a corresponding stable job.
Okay, so bringing this all together, wow, we've covered a lot of ground today. From those potential shifts in FERS, some on, some off, to the big ongoing debates around Social Security's future, and these really significant budget proposals being discussed. What would you say are the most important sort of overall takeaways for our listener, for the learner listening right now?
I think the biggest takeaway is just how dynamic this whole situation is. We're seeing potential changes discussed that could really impact federal employees, retirees, and frankly, many Americans in pretty significant ways. While some of those initial, maybe alarming proposed FERS changes, like the big contribution hike or the switch to high five, seem to be off the table or delayed for now.
Right, the updates were key there.
Absolutely. But other areas, like the long-term future of that Social Security annuity supplement after 2028 or potential FEHB audits, those are still relevant points to watch. And beyond FERS, the broader discussions around Social Security reform, potential tax relief for seniors, they're definitely continuing. And of course, the Trump administration's budget proposals signal potentially major shifts in federal spending priorities, with cuts in some areas and increases in others.
And it's just so crucial to remember, isn't it, that so much of what we've talked about today is still in the realm of proposals or maybe draft legislation. The legislative process is messy, it's complex, it's definitely not a done deal. Things can absolutely change and probably will as these ideas move or don't move through Congress.
Couldn't agree more. This has really just been a snapshot in time. These are active, ongoing conversations. The final outcomes could end up looking quite different from what's being debated right now. So, staying informed as things develop is really going to be key.
Absolutely. So for you, the learner, as you think about all these interconnected retirement systems, tax policies, budget decisions, how they might affect you, what are the most critical factors you are going to be paying attention to in the coming weeks and months? What will you be watching to understand the potential long-term effects, not just on your own financial well-being, but maybe on the broader economy too? We really encourage you to maybe check out some of the sources we mentioned, dig a little deeper, and keep engaging with these complex and frankly really important issues.